All right, guys, I don't know if you have gotten a chance to look at your packet yet, but if you look at day 2, the title is Understanding Powers of 10. And you may look at that and say, Miss Montrose, we haven't done exponents. We haven't talked about what a power of 10 is. We just now started to learn how to multiply and divide decimals, and it just looks confusing. So what I decided to do is to actually walk you guys through the entire paper. That way we can work on it together as if we were actually in school. So the first thing that I want to talk about is I want to talk about what an exponent is. Now with powers of 10, we are just going to talk about exponents with 10, right? So you may see something like 10 to the second power, or we call that 10 squared. Or 10 to the third power, or we call that 10 cubed. Or 10 to the fourth power, 10 to the fifth power, 10 to the sixth power, and we can keep going and keep going and keep going. But let's talk about what that exponent actually means. So in third grade, we talk about repeated addition and how it represents multiplication. Well, exponents is repeated, it's just repeated multiplication. So when I see a power of 10 that says 10 to the second power, or 10 squared, I'm just saying 10 times 10, okay, which is 100. Or you may see on your paper that I have 10 to the third power, or 10 cubed. That's the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10, which is 1,000. Right? You may also see 10 to the fourth power, which is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. You are doing repeated multiplication based on what the power or what the exponent is saying. Well, 10 times 10 is 100, times another 10 is 1,000, times another 10 is 10,000. Okay? You may also see, not on this worksheet, but just in everyday life, you may see something like 10 to the fifth power. And you're just going to multiply 10 5 times. 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. Okay. Well, I know that 10 times 10 is 100, times another 10 is 1,000, times another 10 is 10,000, times another 10 is 100,000. Okay. And I want you to look at all of these answers, and I want you to take a second to pause the video and see what kind of pattern that you notice. Well, if you took a second to look at the pattern, you may have noticed that each time I add an exponent, I am actually going up in place value. Okay, I go from the hundreds place to the thousands place to the 10,000s place to the hundreds thousands place. So if I did 10 to the sixth power, it'd be same thing as 10 times 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tens times another 10. And you got that right. It'd be 1 million because you're going up to another place value. So let's talk about what that means when I am taking my power of 10 and I am multiplying or dividing it by a whole number or a decimal. When I am multiplying a whole number or a decimal or dividing it, I am either moving it up or down in the place value chart. So let's look at problem number 1. Okay. Problem number 1 says 6 divided by 10. Okay. And you guys probably said, well, Miss Montrose, 6 divided by 10, we learned that fractions and division are the same thing. So 6 divided by 10 is the same thing as 6/10. And you're right. And I would accept that answer, but let's talk about what that would be in decimal form. If I am taking the number 6, I want to put it in the place value chart. Well, I know that this is my hundreds, this is my tens, this is my ones, and here's my decimal. So that's going to represent my tenths place value, my hundreds place value, and my thousandths place value. So let's go ahead and insert 6 in our place value chart. Well, I know that 6 goes in 6 ones. Well, 6 ones is the same thing as 6 and a decimal at the end. Because remember, any whole number always has a decimal at the end. You just don't always see that decimal if there's no decimal place value behind it. Right? So anytime you're in a place value chart and you are multiplying it by a value of 10 or dividing it by a value of 10, anytime that you are multiplying a decimal or a whole number by a power of 10, you are going up in place value, just like we talked about a minute ago. So that's going to represent multiplication. Anytime you are dividing a number by a power of 10, you're going down in place value. Okay. All right. So in this case, I'm dividing by 1 power of 10. Okay. And every time you go down in place value, you're dividing by powers of 10. Okay. So let's take it down because we're dividing. So we're going to shift it to the right. We are going to take it and divide it by 10 and move it down 1 place value. Okay. So 6 divided by 10, if I talk about decimals, is the same thing as 6/10. And you can also look at it as, well, Miss Montrose, I went from 6 to 6/10 and I divided it, so I'm just moving my decimal over. And yes, that is a way that you can look at it as well. But I also want to explain why you can just move the decimal. So 6/10 is the same thing as 6/10. So that should be your final answer. All right, let's look at problem number 2. I have 6/10 divided by 10. And since we are dividing it, we are going to move it down the place value chart. Okay, into a lesser value, right? So when I do that, I am going to take my decimal and I am going to move it 1 place value to the left. Okay? So 6/10 divided by 10 is 6/100. And let me explain why it equals 6/100. All right, so let's go ahead and put 6/10 in our place value chart. Okay, and remember when we are dividing, we are moving it down the place value into a lesser place. Okay, so if I'm dividing by 1 power of 10, I am just going to move it down into the next place value. And then just in your tenths place, if I have 6/100 and I don't have any 0/10, if I have 6/100, that means I have 0/10 is what I was trying to say. And then your decimal goes right there. So even though you're moving it down the place value chart, your decimal is just shifting to the left. All right, let's look at problem number 3. It says 6 divided by 10 to the second power. Okay. Well, I know that 10 to the second power, remember, it's just repeated multiplication, is the same thing as 10 times 10. So because it's 10 times 10, we're not just going to move it down by 1 place value. We're actually moving it down by 2 powers of 10. So we're going to move it down 2 place values of the place value chart. All right, so 6 wholes or 6 ones is the same thing as 6 decimal. All right, well, let's go ahead and move our decimal 2 place values to the left. Well, here's how it represents 1 power of 10, but we have 2 powers of 10, so we need to move it down 1 more time. So now our decimal goes here, and we replace that gap with a 0. Okay, so 6 divided by 10 to the second power is the same thing as 6/100. Okay, so let's put 6 ones. And remember, anytime that we are dividing, you're going down in place value. Okay, well, here's 1 power of 10. So let's move it down 1 power of 10. And then another power of 10, because there's 2 of them. Move it down another power of 10. And you have the same answer. All right, let's look at problem number 4. I have 6/10 divided by 10 to the second power. And remember, 10 to the second power is just repeated addition, repeated multiplication. 10 times 10, so 2 powers of 10. All right, so let's work that out. I have 6/10. Okay, and we are dividing, so I'm going to move my decimal place value to the left 2 times because I have 1 power of 10 and another power of 10. So move it 1 power of 10 and the second power of 10. Put your decimal there and fill in the gap with a 0. Okay, so instead of 6/10, I now have 6 thousandths. All right, let's look at number 5. All right. I have 6 divided by 10 to the third power. Okay. That is the same thing as saying 10 times 10 times 10. Okay. So instead of 1 power of 10 or 2 powers of 10, I now have 3 powers of 10. So 6 wholes is the same thing as 6 with a decimal in the end, because remember that decimal separates my whole numbers from my part of a whole. So because we're dividing, we're going to move the decimal to the left 3 times, because we have 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10. So 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10. Move your decimal there. Fill in the tenths and the hundredths place with zeros. And 6 divided by 10 to the third power is 6 thousandths. All right, let's look at number 6. Number 6 is 60 divided by 10 to the third power. Okay. All right, so 10 to the third power is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10. Okay. Well, if I have a whole number 60, that means my invisible decimal is right there. And I am dividing, so I'm going to move my decimal to the left 3 powers of 10. 1 power of 10, 2 power of 10, 3 powers of 10. So 1, 2, 3. And then put my 0 right in that tenths place value. So 60 divided by 10 to the third power is the same thing as, you can either say 60 thousandths or 6 hundredths. All right, let's look at number 7. I have 0 and 3 tenths times 10. Okay, now let's talk about what that looks like. You notice that it is different because we are actually multiplying in this case. So let's talk about what that looks like on our place value chart. All right, let's go ahead and put our number in our place value chart. I have 3 tenths, so it's going to go under the 3 tenths place value. And I am multiplying. So anytime that I am multiplying, I am actually going up in value. Okay, before we divided, so we are going down, right? So anytime you go down, you're dividing. Okay. In this case, we are multiplying, so we are going to go up in value. I am only multiplying by 1 power of 10. So if I'm multiplying by 1 value of 10, that 3 is actually going to shift to the left in our ones place value. So 3 tenths times 10 is 3. Okay. And what we just did the opposite, because multiplication is the opposite of division. So 3 tenths, instead of moving it to the left to make it smaller, I'm actually going to move my decimal place value to the right. So it becomes 3 decimal, which is the same thing as 3. So when you're multiplying, you are moving your decimal to the right. When you're dividing, you're moving your decimal to the left. All right, let's look at number 8. Number 8 says 0 and 3 tenths times 10 to the second power, okay? And 10 to the second power is the same thing as 10 times 10. Okay? So I have 0 and 3 tenths. And because we are multiplying, we're actually going to move our decimal to the right because we're going up in value. So I'm going to move it 1 place value to the right. And I have 2 powers of 10. So I'm not only going to move it 1 power of 10, I'm going to move it another power of 10 and put my decimal here. Okay, and fill in, so now that 3 has shifted to our tens place, and fill in your ones place with a 0. Okay, so 3 tenths times 10 to the second power is 30 decimal, really nothing, because nothing's in our decimal place value. So it's the same thing as saying 30. All right, let's talk about what that looks like in our place value chart. All right, so if I have 3 tenths, I'm going to go ahead and put that in my decimal place value. And I am multiplying, so my place value is going up. Every time I go up a place value or a power of 10, I'm multiplying. Okay, so I'm going to put it up, move it to the left, and increase it by 1 power to the 10 and another power of a 10. So now you see, like I said before, my 3 is in my tens place value. I put a 0 in my ones, and my answer is 30. All right, let's look at number 9. Number 9 is 3 tenths times 10 to the third power. Okay, and 10 to the third power is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10. All right, so I am not going to move it by, not only by 1 power of 10, but 2 and 3 powers of 10. All right, so look, it's 3 tenths And because I am going up in value, I want to move my decimal to the right. Remember, multiplying is to the right. Dividing, move your decimal to the left. Okay, so let's move it by 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, and 3 powers of 10. So my decimal is now going to go all the way over here, and I'm going to fill in those place values with zeros. Okay, so now that my decimal is over here, that means that this 0 is in my ones place, this 0 is in my tens place, and that 3 is in my hundreds place. So 3/10 times 10 to the power of 3, or 10 cubed, is the same thing as 300. All right, let's look at problem number 10. All right, guys, we're on problem number 10. I have 0 and 300ths times 10 to the second power. All right, let's look at this one. I have 300ths times 10 to the second power. Oops, let me get my pencil. All right, that's the same thing as saying 10 times 10, because I am multiplying it by 2 powers of 10. All right, so if I have 0 and 300ths and I am multiplying, remember when we're multiplying, we want to move our decimal to the right because we're shifting it up to a higher place value. So move it to the right for one decimal, or for 1 power of 10 and the other power of 10. So instead of 300ths, I now have 3 with a decimal on the end of it, which is equivalent to 3. So 300ths times 10 to the second power is 3. All right, moving on to number 11. I have 0 and 3,000ths times 10 to the second power. And 10 to the second power is the same thing as 10 times 10. So we want to move, because we're multiplying, we want to move our decimal place value to the right. So I have 0 and 3,000ths. Move it one place value for 1 power of 10 and another place value for another power of 10. And it puts the decimal point right in front of the 3. And if it's right in front of the 3, then that is equivalent to 3/10. So 3,000ths times 10 to the second power is 3/10. All right, moving on to number 12. I have 300ths times 10 to the third power. And 10 to the third power, which you can also say is 10 cubed, is 10 times 10 times 10. All right, so we are multiplying 300ths times 10 to the third power, so we are moving our decimal place value to the right. So 0 and 300ths is the same thing as moving it one place value to the right and another place value to the right, which puts our decimal behind the 3. So that is 3 point, which is the same thing as 3. So your answer for number 12 should be 3. All right, let's look at number 13. Moving on. All right, that equation says 72 divided by 10. Make that division a little bigger so you don't think it's a minus sign. Okay, and here I'm dividing whole numbers. So you guys have already learned that dividing fractions, or division and fractions, are the same thing. So 72 divided by 10 is the same thing as 72 over 10, which is an improper fraction. 10 goes into 72 7 times with a remainder of 2/10. Okay, now we are dividing by powers of 10, so we are going to treat this as a decimal. Okay, and I did this in fraction form to show you how the fractions and the decimals kind of relate. Okay, well, if I have 72, that's the same thing as saying 72 with a decimal on the end. Well, this time I am dividing, so I am moving my decimal to the left. Remember, multiplying, you're moving your decimal to the right. Dividing, you are moving your decimal to the left. All right, so I am only dividing by 1 power of 10, so I'm only going to move it one place value. So now my decimal is right here, so it is still equal to 7 and 2/10. 7 and 2/10 is fraction form, 7 and 2/10 in decimal form. So that is your answer. It is equivalent to each other. All right, moving on to number 14. Alrighty, that is 72 hundredths times 10 to the second power. Okay, 10 to the second power is the same thing as 10 times 10. And we are multiplying in this case, so we are moving our decimal place value to the right. So 72 hundredths times 10 to the second power, I am moving my decimal place value to the right 2 times because I have 1 power of 10 and another power of 10. So 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10. It now puts my decimal on the end of my number. So 72 with a decimal on the end is the same thing as 72 wholes. Okay, because there's nothing in my decimal place value, I have 2 ones and 77 tens, which is 72. All right, number 15. All right, let me see. It is 7,200 divided by 10 to the third power. Okay, 10 to the third power is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10, and we are dividing, so we are moving our decimal to the left. So if I have 7,200, that means that my decimal place value is on the right, on the very end, because it's a whole number, so that means I don't have any decimal place value. And I am moving my decimal place value by 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10 to the left. So 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, and 3 powers of 10. Okay, so if I move that over, that is the same thing as 7 and 2 hundredths, or you can say 7 and 2 tenths, however you want to say it. So the answer to number 15 is 7 and 2 hundredths, or you can take the zeros off and make it 7 and 2 tenths, whichever one you prefer to do. I would accept either. All right, I do want to talk about what this looks like in the decimal place value chart, because this was a little bit of a bigger number, so it is a little trickier. So let me go ahead and label all my place values: my thousandths place, my hundredths place, my tenths place. Got my decimal, my ones place, my tens place, my hundreds, and my thousands place. Okay, my number is 7,200. Okay, and anytime that I am dividing, I am moving my place value down. So, which is the same thing as moving my decimal to the left. And so let's go ahead and move it down 1 power of 10, so it shifts down here. And then go ahead and move it another power of 10, which would shift it down here. And then another power of 10, which would shift it down here. And so now I have 7 ones, 2 tenths, 0 hundredths, 0 thousandths. So it is still the same answer. I just decided to shift it down in place value instead of moving the decimal. So I just want to keep reiterating this is why we're moving the decimal. Okay. Moving on to number 16. I have 20 divided by 10 to the second power. 10 to the second power is the same thing as 10 times 10. I am dividing, so I'm going to go down, move my place value to the left, and move my decimal to the left, and that moves my decimal place value down in value. So 20 wholes is the same thing as 20 with a decimal on the end. Again, we just usually do not see that invisible decimal unless we're talking about a decimal place value. So I want to move it down 1 power of 10, another power of 10. So move it to the left because we're dividing, and another power of 10 puts that decimal right in the front of that 2, which is the same thing as, you can either say 20 hundredths or you can knock that 0 off and say 2 tenths, whichever one you prefer. All right, number 17 is what number we're on now. We have 9 tenths times 10 to the third power. All right, 10 to the third power is the same thing as saying 10 times 10 times 10. And we are multiplying, so now we are moving our decimal place value to the right. Remember, when you are multiplying, you're moving your decimal to the right. When you're dividing, you're moving your decimal to the left, because it depends on which side of the place value chart it's going. Alrighty, so if I have 9 tenths times 10 to the third power, I have my decimal, and I'm going to move it right 3 times. So 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, and a third power of 10. So now that puts my decimal at the very end. Well, instead of my 9 now being in my 1 or my tenths place value, my 9 is now in my hundreds. So it now becomes 900. All right, let me show you what that looks like in a decimal place value chart. And guys, if we were at school, you guys would have your own decimal place value chart, and we would work through this really slowly. But again, I just kind of wanted to throw this at you so that you guys can have a little bit of instruction before you guys get to middle school. All right, so this is the thousandths my hundredths place value, and my tenths. And guys, this is a review from when we did our decimal units. You guys should already know this. And then my ones place value, my tens, my hundreds place value. All right, I have the number 9/10. And since I am multiplying it by power 10, I'm actually going to go up in place value. So whenever I go up in place value, my decimal is moving to the right. So that's why we're moving it to the right. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move it up, multiply it times 10. Now that 9 goes into the ones place value. I am multiplying it by 3 powers of 10. So there's 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10. Because every time I multiply it, it's going up in value. So now I've moved it or multiplied it by 3 powers of 10. So now that 9 is in my hundreds place value. Fill in my tens and my ones with zeros, and that is where I got 900. All right, moving on to 18. 18 is 1,000th times 10 to the second place value, or 10 to the second power, or 10 squared, however you want to say it. And that is equivalent to 10 times 10 because you're multiplying it by 2 powers of 10. And we are multiplying, so I am moving my decimal place value to the right. Okay, and I'm going to quit rewriting it down here. I'm just going to move my decimal place value up here. I'm going to move it 1 place value, 2 place values. And so it puts that decimal right in front of the 1, and that now reads as 1/10. So 1,000th times 10 to the second power is the same thing as 1/10. All right, number 19. 54 divided by 10. All right, now we have two whole numbers again, so we can set it up as a fraction if you want to, or you can just go ahead and put your decimal on the end. We only have 1 power of 10, so we're only going to move it once. This time we're dividing, so we are going to move it to the left. All right, and I'm going to shift the decimal to the left 1 time when I divide it by 1 power of 10. So 54 divided by 10 is 5 4/10. If you guys were to write it in fraction form, like we learned towards the beginning of the year, that would make it 54 over 10, because fractions and division are the same thing, and that is improper. So 10 goes into 54 5 whole times with a remainder of 4/10. So 5 4/10 still reads 5 4/10, but in decimal form. All right, let's look at number 20. I have 150 divided by 10 to the third power. Okay, 10 to the third power is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10. We are dividing, so I'm going to move my decimal place value to the left. We're looking at a whole number, so my decimal goes on the end. It's kind of an imaginary decimal when we're talking about whole numbers. And I'm going to shift it to the left 3 times because I am dividing by 3 powers of 10. So 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10. Stick the decimal right in front of that 1 when we shift it. So now it becomes 150,000. Or you can say 1,500ths, whichever way you want to say it, or whichever answer you want to record. All right, guys, let's look at the last one, number 21. I have 4,600 times 10 to the third power. 10 to the third power is the same thing as 10 times 10 times 10. And we are multiplying, so let's move my decimal place value to the right. Okay. All right, so we're going to move it 3 times because we're multiplying by 3 powers of 10. I'm going to rewrite it down here so I have more room. Whoops. Let me fix that. All right, there we go. All right, so multiply, shift it down 1 power of 10, 2 powers of 10, 3 powers of 10. That decimal goes on the very end. Fill in that 1 place value with a 0. So now I have 460. And then the number 22, it says, what strategies did you use to solve the problems, and explain? You guys can talk about how you moved the decimal. You guys can talk about how we shifted the values in a decimal place value chart. However you guys want to explain what strategies we use. I know that this is kind of difficult because we haven't looked at any exponents. We haven't divided by powers of 10. We haven't done any of that. So guys, just bear with me. I know it's not the easiest thing that we're doing right now, but if you have any further questions, please just reach out to me via email message me on your Parents Remind app. However you guys want to get in touch with me, and I can answer any kind of questions that you have. Don't forget, my office hours are also on Thursday from 2:30 to 3:30. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.